The morning sun had barely crested the horizon when Marcus and Daniel Reeves spotted the listing buoy through the early fog, its rusted orange surface catching the first light like a beacon calling them forward. The massive navigation marker had been reported adrift 3 days earlier, and the brothers had won the salvage rights at a modest auction price that seemed almost too good to be true. Their small maritime salvage business had been struggling through a particularly lean season, and this single piece of equipment promised enough scrap metal to keep them afloat for another month. Neither brother could have imagined that their routine salvage operation would lead them to a discovery that defied all rational explanation, a finding that would thrust them into a mystery spanning decades and involving secrets that powerful people had worked tirelessly to keep buried beneath the waves. The Reeves brothers had inherited their salvage business from their father, who had spent 40 years working the coastal waters of the Pacific Northwest, recovering everything from abandoned fishing equipment to derelict pleasure craft. Their operation was modest but respected, built on a foundation of hard work, intimate knowledge of the treacherous local waters, and an unwavering commitment to safety. Marcus, the elder at 38, handled the business logistics and diving operations, while 34-year-old Daniel managed their vessel and coordinated with maritime authorities. If you're fascinated by mysteries hidden beneath the ocean's surface, make sure to hit that subscribe button and activate notifications so you never miss our incredible true stories. And if you're really enjoying this mystery, consider becoming a channel member or sending a super thanks to support our work bringing these amazing tales to light. We want to hear from you too. Drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from and what you think this discovery might be. Their boat, the Sea Ranger, cut through the gentle swells with practiced ease as they approached the drifting buoy. The massive structure stood nearly 12 feet tall, its cylindrical body showing the wear of decades spent battling the elements. Thick patches of rust bloomed across its surface like ancient flowers, and colonies of barnacles clung to its waterline in dense, encrusted layers. The identification numbers that should have marked its origin had long since faded or been deliberately removed, leaving only ghost traces of paint and the faint impression of numbers that might have once designated its position in some forgotten maritime grid. Daniel maneuvered the Sea Ranger alongside the buoy with the precision born of years on the water, maintaining a careful distance while Marcus prepared their equipment. The plan was straightforward: secure a tow line to the buoy's attachment point, check for any structural issues that might complicate the tow, and haul their prize back to their salvage yard where they would methodically dismantle it for scrap. The brothers had executed this exact procedure dozens of times with various pieces of maritime equipment. Nothing about this particular salvage operation seemed unusual or remarkable as Marcus pulled on his work gloves and prepared to transfer to the buoy for a closer inspection. The first hint that something was different came when Marcus reached out to grasp the buoy's service ladder. The entire structure shifted unnaturally under his weight, not with the expected bobbing motion of a floating object, but with a strange resistance, as though something beneath the surface was anchoring it in place. Marcus paused, his experienced instincts immediately recognizing that the buoy's behavior didn't match its apparent specifications. Navigation buoys were designed to float freely, their weighted bases providing stability while allowing them to respond naturally to wave action. This buoy moved as though it were tethered to something substantial below, something that was creating drag against the current. Marcus signaled to Daniel, indicating the unusual resistance, and his brother immediately reduced the boat's engine to idle. In their line of work, unexpected anomalies demanded careful attention. The ocean was an unforgiving environment where assumptions could prove fatal, and years of experience had taught both brothers to investigate anything that deviated from expected patterns. Marcus carefully climbed onto the buoy's service platform, testing each handhold before committing his full weight. The structure groaned under him, metal fatigued by years of saltwater exposure protesting this new burden. From his elevated position on the buoy, Marcus could see down into the water with greater clarity. The morning sun had burned through the fog, and visibility in the relatively calm water extended perhaps 20 feet below the surface. What he observed made him call out sharply to Daniel. Heavy chains, far more substantial than any standard anchor cable, descended from the buoy's base into the dark water below. These weren't the typical chains used to anchor navigation markers. They were industrial grade, each link as thick as a man's wrist, showing signs of corrosion but still maintaining their structural integrity after what must have been years, perhaps decades, submerged in the corrosive saltwater environment. Daniel positioned the Sea Ranger for a better view, and both brothers stared down into the water, trying to trace the chain's descent into the depths. The links disappeared into darkness about 15 feet down, but there was something else visible in the water, a shadow, a shape that didn't belong to the natural underwater landscape. It was too regular, too geometric to be a rock formation or accumulated debris. Whatever was down there was substantial, perhaps as large as the buoy itself, suspended in the water column by those mysterious chains. Marcus descended from the buoy and returned to the Sea Ranger, his mind already running through possibilities. Perhaps this was some kind of underwater equipment storage, a method sometimes used by fishing operations to cache gear between seasons. But the chain seemed far too heavy for that purpose, and the location was wrong, too far from shore for convenient access, too deep for casual retrieval. Another possibility was that the buoy had inadvertently become entangled with some other piece of maritime debris, though the deliberate nature of the chain attachment argued against accidental entanglement. The brothers conferred briefly, weighing their options. They could simply attach their towline and haul the buoy back as planned, leaving whatever was chained beneath as someone else's problem. They could report the anomaly to the Coast Guard and let official channels handle the investigation. Or they could satisfy their curiosity and investigate further, determining exactly what was suspended in the water below. The choice wasn't difficult. The Reeves brothers hadn't built their reputation by walking away from mysteries, and both felt an undeniable pull to understand what they had discovered. Daniel retrieved their underwater camera system, a ruggedized setup they used for hull inspections and underwater salvage assessments. The camera was mounted on a telescoping pole that allowed them to lower it into the water while monitoring the feed on a waterproof display screen. Marcus controlled the pole while Daniel watched the screen, both brothers leaning over the rail as the camera descended along the chain's length. The water clarity was good, better than they typically encountered in these coastal waters, and the camera's powerful LED lights cut through the gloom with surprising effectiveness. The screen showed the chain descending steadily, link after massive link passing before the camera lens. Small fish darted away from the unfamiliar light, and once a curious seal approached the camera before losing interest and swimming away. At 30 feet, the chains continued downward without any sign of what they were supporting. At 40 feet, the camera's lights began to reflect off something metallic below, a surface that gleamed dully in the LED illumination. Daniel adjusted the camera angle, trying to capture more detail, and suddenly both brothers understood that they were looking at something far more complex than a simple submerged container. The object suspended in the water was cylindrical, perhaps 8 feet in diameter and extending beyond the camera's field of view in length. Its surface was covered in the same rusty patina as the buoy above, with similar colonies of marine growth establishing themselves across every available surface. But there were features visible that marked this as manufactured technology. Seams where metal plates had been welded together, circular ports sealed with heavy glass or reinforced plastic, and stenciled markings that had survived decades of submersion to remain partially legible on the metal skin. Marcus manipulated the camera slowly, panning across the submerged object's surface, trying to build a complete picture of what they had found. The cylindrical body extended downward at least 20 feet, perhaps more, with the bottom section disappearing into darker water beyond the camera's effective range. Near what appeared to be the top section of the cylinder, additional chains were visible, these connecting to the massive links that rose to the buoy above. The entire assembly was engineered to keep this object suspended at a specific depth, neither sinking to the bottom nor rising to the surface, held in a precise position in the water column by the buoy's buoyancy counteracting the object's weight. Daniel's voice was quiet when he finally spoke, articulating what both brothers were thinking. This wasn't maritime equipment or fishing gear or any kind of normal underwater storage. This was sophisticated, purpose-built, and had been deliberately placed at this location and depth for reasons they couldn't begin to fathom. The scale of the operation implied resources and planning far beyond what any private individual could muster. This was the work of an organization, possibly a government entity, engaged in some activity that required secrecy and permanent concealment beneath the waves. The brothers retrieved the camera and sat in the Sea Ranger's cabin, reviewing the footage they had captured. The stenciled markings on the cylinder's surface were tantalizingly incomplete, weathered by time and marine growth, but certain letters and numbers were still distinguishable. Marcus froze the playback on the clearest image and studied it intently. The markings appeared to be alphanumeric codes, possibly identification numbers or project designations, but they didn't match any standard maritime classification system he recognized. Their discovery presented a dilemma. Whatever this submerged object was, it clearly represented something significant, possibly something that had been classified or deliberately hidden. Simply hauling the buoy to their salvage yard would leave the mystery unsolved, but more importantly, it might bring unwanted attention from whoever had placed this equipment here decades ago. On the other hand, reporting their find to authorities might result in the brothers being excluded from any further involvement, their discovery claimed under maritime law or national security provisions that would leave them with nothing but questions. Marcus made the decision that would alter the trajectory of the next several weeks of their lives. They would investigate further, but carefully and discreetly. They would document everything meticulously, gather as much information as possible, and only then decide how to proceed. Daniel agreed with his brother's assessment, and they began planning their next steps. The first requirement was better underwater documentation. The camera on a pole had provided useful initial imagery, but truly understanding what they had found would require a direct diving inspection. The brothers spent the remainder of that day preparing for a proper dive operation. They marked the buoy's position with a GPS beacon, then returned to their harbor to gather specialized equipment. Marcus was an experienced diver, holding advanced certifications that allowed him to conduct salvage operations in challenging conditions. Daniel, while not a diver himself, was trained in surface support procedures and had managed countless dive operations over the years. Together they represented a capable team, but both recognized that diving on an unknown underwater object carried inherent risks that required careful mitigation. They returned to the site the following morning equipped for a comprehensive investigation. Marcus wore a full commercial diving rig with primary and backup air supplies, underwater lights, cameras, and communication equipment that would allow Daniel to monitor the dive from the surface. They had also brought additional documentation equipment, including a high-resolution underwater camera system capable of capturing detailed images and video in the low-light conditions they expected at depth. The descent began with Marcus following the chain line downward, his powerful dive lights cutting through the water and revealing details that the camera pole had missed the previous day. The chain links showed signs of advanced corrosion in places, but the overall structure remained sound, testament to the quality of the original materials and engineering. At 20 feet, Marcus paused to equalize pressure and adjust his buoyancy before continuing downward. At 30 feet, the full form of the submerged cylinder began to emerge from the gloom below him. The object was even larger than their initial assessment had suggested. The cylindrical body extended at least 30 feet in length, with a diameter approaching 10 feet at its widest point. The entire structure was suspended in the water column, held at this precise depth by the chains connected to the buoy above and additional chains that descended to what appeared to be anchor points on the sea floor far below. Marcus swam slowly around the cylinder's circumference, documenting every detail with his cameras while describing what he saw through the communication system to Daniel on the surface. The cylinder's exterior was constructed from heavy-gauge steel, welded in sections that suggested it had been assembled from multiple components. The welding showed professional quality, with neat, consistent beads that had survived decades of saltwater exposure remarkably well. Periodic inspection ports punctuated the cylinder's length, each sealed with thick glass or polymer windows reinforced with metal frames. Through these windows, Marcus could see hints of the interior, spaces that had once contained equipment or supplies, now largely empty but showing signs of their former purpose through mounting brackets, cable runs, and structural reinforcements built into the walls. Near the cylinder's top section, Marcus discovered markings that were far more legible than those visible on the camera footage. Stenciled in paint that had somehow resisted complete degradation, He could make out a designation code followed by a date. The code meant nothing to him immediately, but the date was clear enough: 1972. Whatever this object was, it had been placed here more than 5 decades ago, during an era when the Cold War was at its height and governments on both sides of the ideological divide were engaged in secretive military and intelligence operations that often pushed the boundaries of technology and international law. Further exploration revealed additional features that helped Marcus begin to form a hypothesis about the cylinder's purpose. Along one side, he found what appeared to be a sealed hatch, its circular door secured with massive bolts and fitted with rubber gaskets that had long since deteriorated but still showed their original purpose, maintaining a watertight seal capable of withstanding significant pressure. Near the hatch was a small panel with gauges or indicators of some kind, their faces clouded and unreadable after decades submerged, but clearly part of some monitoring or control system that had once been functional. The bottom section of the cylinder descended to where additional chains connected to weights on the sea floor. Marcus followed these chains down, his depth gauge indicating 55 feet as he approached the bottom anchors. The weights were massive concrete blocks, each one easily weighing several tons, positioned to counteract the cylinder's buoyancy and maintain its suspension at the predetermined depth. The entire assembly was an engineering feat, designed to function autonomously for decades without maintenance, keeping this mysterious object hidden beneath the waves while preventing it from either sinking to the bottom or floating to the surface where it might be discovered. As Marcus ascended back up the cylinder's length, conducting a final survey before returning to the surface, his light caught something that made him stop and hover in the water, controlling his buoyancy with practiced skill while he examined what he had found. On the cylinder's side, partially obscured by marine growth, was a small plaque or label made from what appeared to be stainless steel. He carefully brushed away the accumulated biological material, revealing text that had been engraved deeply enough to survive the decades of submersion. The label contained more identification codes, some technical specifications that meant little to Marcus without proper context, and one phrase that sent a chill through him despite the adequate thermal protection of his diving suit. The phrase read, "Project Deep Watch, authorized personnel only, security classification, top secret." Marcus completed his ascent following proper decompression protocols, his mind racing with the implications of what he had discovered. The cylinder wasn't just some piece of abandoned military hardware or a forgotten experiment. It was part of a classified government project, something considered sensitive enough to carry the highest security designation, and it had been deliberately hidden in these waters for more than half a century. The question that dominated his thoughts as he climbed back aboard the Sea Ranger was simple but profound. What could be inside that cylinder that justified such elaborate concealment, and why had it been left here, apparently forgotten or abandoned by whoever had placed it? Daniel had been monitoring the dive through the communication system and had heard Marcus's descriptions of what he was finding. When Marcus removed his diving helmet and they could speak face to face, both brothers understood that they had stumbled into something far more significant than a simple salvage operation. They had discovered what appeared to be a remnant of Cold War-era secret operations, a physical artifact of activities that governments had never publicly acknowledged and probably hoped would remain hidden forever. The brothers spent the afternoon aboard the Sea Ranger, reviewing the extensive footage and photographs Marcus had captured during his dive. Every image told part of the story, revealing details about the cylinder's construction, purpose, and the sophistication of the engineering that had gone into its creation and deployment. The more they studied the evidence, the more questions emerged. If this was indeed a secret government installation from the 1970s, why had it been abandoned? Who knew it was still here? Were there others like it scattered in deep water locations along the coast? And most intriguingly, what had been stored or housed within that massive cylinder during its operational life? Daniel suggested the most cautious course of action, documenting everything they had found, then reporting their discovery to appropriate authorities and stepping back. Marcus understood his brother's reasoning, but he also felt an almost irresistible pull to understand more about what they had found. This discovery represented a piece of hidden history, a glimpse into activities that had shaped the world during one of the most dangerous periods of the 20th century. Simply handing it over to government agencies who would likely classify everything again and ensure no information ever reached the public seemed like a betrayal of the incredible opportunity they had been given. They compromised on a middle path. They would continue investigating and documenting what they had found, but they would also begin quietly reaching out to experts who might help them understand the cylinder's purpose and significance. They would be discreet, avoiding any publicity that might attract unwanted attention before they fully understood what they had discovered. And they would maintain absolute security over the location, ensuring that no one else could find or interfere with the site until they had decided on the appropriate course of action. That evening, back in their small office at the salvage yard, Marcus began researching Project Deep Watch, the designation he had found on the cylinder's identification plaque. Standard internet searches revealed nothing. No references in declassified documents, no mentions in historical accounts of Cold War operations, no acknowledgement that such a project had ever existed. He expanded his search to include academic databases, military history forums, and collections of declassified government documents that had been made public through Freedom of Information Act requests over the years. Still nothing. The complete absence of any information about Project Deep Watch told its own story. Either this had been such a deeply classified operation that no documentation had survived the decades since its apparent conclusion, or someone had been very thorough about removing any trace of it from public records. Marcus found several references to other covert programs from the same era, operations with similarly innocuous code names that had been revealed decades later through investigative journalism or official declassification. But Deep Watch remained a phantom, leaving no footprint in the historical record. Daniel took a different approach, reaching out through carefully worded messages to contacts they had developed over years in the maritime salvage business. Harbor masters, Coast Guard personnel, commercial divers, and marine archaeologists. The brothers knew dozens of people who worked in and around the water, people who heard stories and rumors about unusual discoveries or unexplained phenomena. He crafted his inquiries carefully, asking general questions about Cold War-era installations or equipment without revealing the specifics of what they had found. The responses that trickled in over the next few days were intriguing. Several people mentioned hearing stories about secret installations placed along the coast during the height of Cold War tensions, though details were always vague and second-hand. One retired Navy officer recalled rumors about underwater monitoring stations designed to detect submarine activity, though he had never seen confirmation that such systems had actually been deployed. A marine archaeologist mentioned finding unexplained anchor chains and concrete blocks during surveys of the seafloor, suggesting that other objects might have been placed and possibly later removed, leaving only their anchoring systems behind. Most interesting was a message from an old diving instructor who had taught both brothers decades earlier. He remembered doing some contract work for the Navy in the early 1970s, assisting with the placement of what he was told were oceanographic research modules at various coastal locations. The modules were cylindrical, about the size of a large trailer, and were designed to be suspended at specific depths where they would collect data about water conditions, currents, and marine life. He had thought nothing of it at the time. Such research was common during that era as scientists worked to better understand the ocean environment. But thinking back on it now, he recalled that the security around those operations had seemed excessive for simple research work, and the modules themselves had been far more robust than necessary for scientific instruments. Marcus contacted the diving instructor and arranged a phone call, during which he carefully described what they had found without revealing the specific location. The instructor listened with growing interest, then shared something he had never mentioned before because it had seemed unimportant at the time. On one of the installation dives he had participated in, after the module was secured and the Navy personnel were conducting final checks, he had overheard a conversation between two officers. They had been discussing the module's payload and its sustainability duration, technical terms that seemed odd in the context of oceanographic research. One officer had mentioned something about contingency protocols and retrieval procedures if political situations change, phrases that suggested these installations were more than simple research platforms. This conversation provided Marcus with a new theory about the cylinder's purpose. What if it wasn't a monitoring station or research platform at all? What if it was a storage facility, a way to preposition equipment, supplies, or even weapons in locations where they could be quickly retrieved if needed during a crisis. Such caches had been established on land during the Cold War, hidden supplies intended to support resistance movements or military operations if conventional supply lines were disrupted. An underwater version would be nearly impossible to detect and could remain undiscovered indefinitely unless someone specifically knew where to look. The theory gained support when Marcus discovered declassified documents about a different but possibly related program. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, the United States military had developed several contingency plans for what they called sustained operations in denied environments, essentially worst-case scenarios where normal military logistics would be impossible. Part of these plans involved prepositioning supplies and equipment in hidden locations, creating secret caches that could support personnel operating behind enemy lines or in areas where conventional resupply was impossible. The documents Marcus found didn't mention underwater storage specifically, but they confirmed that the military was thinking along those lines during the exact period when the cylinder would have been placed. While Marcus pursued historical research, Daniel continued investigating the physical evidence they had collected. He spent hours examining the detailed photographs Marcus had captured during the dive, looking for any additional clues about the cylinder's construction or purpose. One detail that caught his attention was the size and placement of the inspection ports along the cylinder's length. These weren't randomly positioned. They corresponded to internal compartments, suggesting the cylinder was divided into separate spaces, each potentially serving a different function or storing different materials. Daniel used the photographs to create a detailed schematic of the cylinder, measuring dimensions and noting the location of every visible feature. His technical drawing revealed that the cylinder was actually composed of at least 5 distinct sections, each one approximately 6 feet long and apparently accessible through internal hatches. This modular construction made sense from an engineering perspective. It would have allowed the cylinder to be assembled from prefabricated sections, making transport and deployment much easier than if it had been constructed as a single unit. The brothers met again that evening to share what they had learned. The picture emerging from their research was both fascinating and troubling. They had discovered what appeared to be a secret Cold War-era cache, a facility designed to store something valuable or dangerous in a location where it would remain hidden indefinitely. The elaborate engineering that had gone into its construction and deployment suggested government resources and official authorization, but the complete absence of any documentation or acknowledgement meant that this was something intended to remain secret, possibly forever. The question of what was inside the cylinder dominated their discussion. The possibilities ranged from mundane but sensitive items like encryption equipment or intelligence documents to more alarming scenarios involving weapons, chemical or biological materials, or technology that would have been considered too dangerous or controversial to acknowledge publicly. Without opening the cylinder, they had no way to know, but the very existence of this installation suggested its contents were significant enough to justify the considerable expense and effort of placing it here. Marcus raised a point that both brothers had been avoiding. If they continued investigating and eventually succeeded in opening the cylinder or revealing its contents, they might be exposing themselves to serious legal jeopardy. Classified government materials remained classified even after decades, and interfering with them, even inadvertently, could constitute a federal crime. They could argue that they had simply discovered abandoned property during a legitimate salvage operation, but they had no way to know how authorities would interpret their actions, especially if the cylinder contained materials that the government still considered sensitive. Despite these concerns, neither brother was ready to abandon their investigation. They had discovered something remarkable, a piece of hidden history that deserved to be understood and documented. They decided to take one more step. They would attempt to access the cylinder's interior, document whatever they found, and then make an informed decision about how to proceed based on what they discovered. If the contents proved to be benign or already documented elsewhere, they could report their find without concern. If they discovered something more sensitive, they would need to carefully consider their options. Preparing for the next phase of their investigation required both brothers to confront the increased risks they were accepting. Accessing the interior of a sealed underwater structure was inherently dangerous, particularly one that had been submerged for over 50 years. The structural integrity of seals, Hinges and mechanical systems would be questionable at best. There was also the unknown factor of what might be inside. If the cylinder had been used to store chemicals or materials that had degraded over time, opening it could release potentially hazardous substances into the water or create explosive decompression scenarios that could injure or kill a diver. Marcus spent 2 days researching underwater salvage techniques for sealed containers and consulting with expert divers who had experience with similar challenges. He developed a careful protocol for the entry attempt that minimized risks while maximizing their chances of success. The plan involved using specialized tools to gradually release pressure from the cylinder's interior before attempting to open any hatches, allowing any gases or liquids to escape slowly in a controlled manner. He would work methodically, never forcing anything that resisted, and would abort the operation immediately if anything unexpected or dangerous occurred. They returned to the site 5 days after their initial discovery, the Sea Ranger loaded with specialized equipment for the entry attempt. The weather had been stable, and conditions looked favorable for the dive. Marcus reviewed his equipment one final time while Daniel conducted a thorough check of all support systems. They both understood that this dive carried more risk than the initial exploration, but they had done everything possible to mitigate those risks through careful planning and preparation. The descent to the cylinder was now familiar territory, but Marcus felt his heart rate increase as he approached the structure. This time he carried a waterproof equipment bag containing the specialized tools he would need, a hydraulic bolt cutter for removing corroded fasteners, pry bars, a portable hydraulic spreader for opening sealed doors, and chemical sensors that would detect any dangerous gases released from the interior. He also wore additional protective equipment including reinforced gloves and a full face mask with integrated communications and redundant air supplies. Marcus positioned himself at the main hatch he had identified during his first dive, the circular door that appeared to provide access to one of the cylinder's internal compartments. He began the careful process of examining the hatch mechanism, identifying the bolts that secured it and assessing their condition. Decades of saltwater exposure had corroded the fasteners severely, but they appeared intact enough to remove with the proper tools. The rubber gasket that sealed the hatch had deteriorated completely, which actually simplified matters. If the seal had remained intact, the pressure differential between the interior and exterior would have made opening the hatch much more difficult. Working slowly and methodically, Marcus began removing the bolts that secured the hatch. Each one required patient work with the hydraulic bolt cutter, the tool's powerful jaws gradually crushing the corroded metal until the bolt could be withdrawn. As each bolt came free, Marcus stored it carefully, maintaining a detailed record of every step of the process through continuous video documentation. After 90 minutes of careful work, he had removed the last securing bolt, and the hatch was held in place only by corrosion and decades of accumulated marine growth. Marcus positioned the hydraulic spreader's tips into the narrow gap between the hatch and its frame, then slowly activated the tool. The spreader's arms extended gradually, applying increasing force to separate the hatch from the cylinder's hull. For a long moment, nothing happened except the creaking protest of stressed metal transmitted through the water. Then, suddenly, the seal broke. The hatch moved slightly, creating a small gap through which trapped gases began to escape in a stream of bubbles that rose toward the surface. Marcus held position, monitoring his chemical sensors and waiting for the initial gas release to complete. The sensors detected elevated levels of carbon dioxide and nitrogen, along with traces of other compounds, but nothing immediately dangerous. The gases were likely just the accumulated result of decades of slow leakage and biological decay of any organic materials that might have been inside. After the initial rush of bubbles subsided, Marcus gradually widened the gap, allowing more time for the interior to equalize with the surrounding water pressure. Finally, with careful leverage from the pry bars, the hatch swung open. Marcus directed his powerful dive lights into the opening, revealing the interior of the cylinder for the first time in over 50 years. What he saw made him pause in wonder, his breath catching slightly as he processed the implications of the discovery. The interior compartment was approximately 6 feet in diameter and 6 feet deep, creating a cylindrical space that had once been dry but was now flooded with seawater that had slowly seeped past deteriorated seals over the decades. The space was filled with equipment racks and storage compartments, most of their contents still intact despite the prolonged submersion. Marcus could see sealed plastic containers, metal boxes with latching mechanisms, and what appeared to be sophisticated electronic equipment mounted in protective housings. Everything was covered with a thin layer of sediment and marine growth, but the overall state of preservation was remarkable given the harsh environment. Marcus carefully maneuvered into the compartment, his movements slow and deliberate to avoid disturbing the delicate archaeological scene before him. He documented everything with his cameras, capturing wide shots of the overall interior layout before moving closer to examine individual items. Many of the storage containers bore labels, though most were too degraded to read completely. He could make out partial words and phrases: emergency, rations, medical, communications, each one providing another clue about the cylinder's intended purpose. In one corner of the compartment, Marcus found what appeared to be a logbook or manual contained in a waterproof case. The case's seal had failed at some point, allowing water inside, but the document itself was protected by what looked like laminated pages designed to survive immersion. Marcus carefully extracted the logbook from its case, handling it with the reverence an archaeologist might show toward an ancient manuscript. Through the clear laminate, he could see printed text and what appeared to be handwritten entries, though reading the actual content would require bringing the logbook to the surface where it could be properly examined. Further exploration of the compartment revealed increasingly sophisticated equipment. One storage rack contained what Marcus recognized as radio equipment, though the specific purpose and capabilities of the devices were beyond his expertise to determine. Another section held what appeared to be weapons, sealed containers sized appropriately for rifles or other firearms, along with smaller boxes that might have contained ammunition or explosives. The presence of weapons confirmed that this wasn't merely a research station or monitoring post. This was a facility designed to support military operations, a cache meant to supply personnel with the tools they would need to conduct covert activities. The most intriguing discovery came when Marcus examined a sealed metal box mounted to the bulkhead near the compartment's far end. Unlike the other storage containers, this box bore prominent warning labels that had survived the decades surprisingly well. The text was stark and unambiguous: classified material, top secret/SCI, unauthorized access prohibited. The SCI designation, Marcus knew, stood for sensitive compartmented information, a security classification reserved for intelligence sources and methods that required protection beyond normal top-secret protocols. Marcus documented the classified container thoroughly but didn't attempt to open it. Whatever it contained, that material represented information the government had considered among its most sensitive secrets. Opening it could expose both brothers to serious legal consequences and might also compromise intelligence sources or methods that could still be relevant even after 5 decades. He made note of the container's location and markings, then completed his documentation of the rest of the compartment before carefully closing and resecuring the hatch as much as possible. The ascent back to the Sea Ranger was conducted according to standard decompression procedures, but Marcus's mind was racing with the implications of what he had found. The cylinder was definitely a Cold War-era military cache, part of a program designed to preposition supplies and equipment in hidden locations where they could support covert operations if needed. The sophistication and comprehensiveness of the stored materials suggested this wasn't a minor contingency plan, but rather a significant element of some larger strategic preparation. Back aboard the Sea Ranger, Marcus and Daniel reviewed the footage and discussed what they had discovered. The logbook, once carefully dried and preserved, would likely provide crucial insights into the cylinder's purpose, the operations it was meant to support, and possibly why it had apparently been abandoned or forgotten. The classified container represented a more complex challenge. They couldn't examine its contents without potentially breaking federal laws, but its presence confirmed that the cylinder had been part of sensitive intelligence operations. The brothers faced a decision that would define how this story concluded. They could report their discovery to federal authorities, turning over all the documentation and information they had gathered, and letting the government handle everything from there. This was the safest and most legally sound approach, but it would almost certainly mean the end of their involvement and likely result in the entire discovery being classified again, with no public acknowledgement of what they had found. Alternatively, They could continue their investigation, document everything as thoroughly as possible, and then strategically release their findings to researchers, historians, and journalists who could ensure the story became part of the public record. This approach carried significant risks, including potential legal action against them, but it would preserve this remarkable piece of history and potentially reveal information about Cold War-era activities that deserve to be part of the historical record. After long discussion, the brothers chose a middle path that honored both their responsibility as citizens and their commitment to historical truth. They would complete their documentation of the cylinder and its contents, carefully preserving the logbook and creating a comprehensive record of everything they had found. They would then contact the appropriate federal agencies and report their discovery, but they would also make it clear that they had documented everything and would be sharing their findings with academic researchers and historians. This approach would prevent the discovery from simply disappearing back into classified obscurity while still respecting the legitimate security concerns that might surround some of the materials. Over the next 2 weeks, Marcus made several additional dives to the cylinder, documenting each of the other compartments and building a complete picture of what had been stored there. Most compartments contained similar materials: supplies, equipment, weapons, and communications gear that would have enabled a small team to operate independently for extended periods. One compartment appeared to have been dedicated to survival equipment, including desalination systems, emergency rations, and medical supplies. Another contained tools and repair equipment, everything needed to maintain weapons and communications gear under field conditions. The most remarkable find came in one of the final compartments Marcus opened. This space contained what appeared to be detailed maps and reconnaissance photographs, all sealed in waterproof containers that had successfully protected their contents from decay. The maps showed coastal areas throughout the Pacific Northwest, with specific locations marked and annotated in handwriting that suggested operational planning. The photographs depicted infrastructure: bridges, power stations, communication facilities, and government buildings, all captured from angles that suggested covert surveillance. These materials painted a clearer picture of the cylinder's intended purpose. This wasn't just a supply cache. It was a complete operational package, everything a covert team would need to conduct intelligence gathering, sabotage, or other clandestine activities along the coast. The fact that it had been placed here in the early 1970s suggested it was part of contingency planning for potential conflict scenarios that, fortunately, never materialized. The Cold War had created an environment where both sides prepared for possibilities that included conventional warfare, nuclear exchange, and everything in between. This cylinder represented one small piece of that vast preparation network. The logbook, once Marcus and Daniel had carefully dried and preserved it, proved to be an invaluable resource. The entries were technical, written in military style with heavy use of abbreviations and code words, but they provided a timeline of the cylinder's deployment and maintenance. The first entry was dated March 15, 1972, and recorded the initial placement of what was designated Cache Unit 7, Project Deep Watch. Subsequent entries, occurring at 6-month intervals, documented inspection dives to verify the cache's integrity and security. The entries revealed that Project Deep Watch had involved at least 12 such cache units placed at strategic locations along the Pacific coast. Each unit was part of a network designed to support what the logbook referred to as deep cover operational teams in various contingency scenarios. The caches were designed to remain undetected indefinitely, maintained through periodic inspections that would verify their security without drawing attention to their locations. The last entry in the logbook was dated October 1978, a routine inspection that noted all systems functioning normally and cache security intact. What happened after 1978 remained unclear. There were no entries indicating deactivation or retrieval of the cache. It simply appeared to have been abandoned, left in place when whatever program it served was either completed, cancelled, or superseded by other approaches. Marcus theorized that bureaucratic changes, shifting strategic priorities, or simple institutional memory loss could have resulted in the cache being forgotten. In the complex world of classified government operations, particularly during periods of organizational restructuring, it wasn't unprecedented for programs to fall through the cracks, their existence known only to a few individuals who might have retired, transferred, or died without passing on complete information to their successors. The brothers compiled their findings into a comprehensive report, including hundreds of photographs, hours of video documentation, detailed descriptions of every item they had found, and careful analysis of the logbook entries. They made multiple copies of everything, storing them in different secure locations to ensure the information wouldn't be lost regardless of what happened next. They also prepared a shorter summary document that could be shared with journalists and researchers, carefully edited to remove any information that might genuinely compromise current intelligence operations or national security. Their next step was to contact federal authorities. Marcus drafted a carefully worded letter addressed to the Department of Defense, the Office of Naval Intelligence, and the National Archives, informing them of the discovery and offering to provide full documentation and access to the site. The letter made clear that the brothers had acted in good faith throughout their investigation, that they had not disturbed any classified materials beyond what was necessary for documentation, and that they were prepared to cooperate fully with any official inquiry into their findings. The response came more quickly than they expected. 3 days after sending their letter, Marcus received a phone call from a man who identified himself as a representative of the Defense Intelligence Agency. The conversation was polite but firm. The representative acknowledged that the brothers had discovered materials related to previously classified operations and requested a meeting to discuss the situation in detail. He emphasized that the government appreciated their discretion and responsible handling of sensitive materials, but he also made clear that there were legal and security issues that needed to be addressed. The meeting took place at a federal building in Seattle, with Marcus and Daniel sitting across a conference table from 3 government representatives: the DIA officer who had made the initial call, a Navy commander specializing in historical classified programs, and an attorney from the Justice Department. The atmosphere was professional but tense as the brothers presented their findings, walking the government officials through their discovery and documentation process. The officials examined the brothers' photographs and documentation with evident interest and some surprise. The Navy commander explained that Project Deep Watch had indeed been a classified program from the Cold War era, part of a broader effort to establish contingency capabilities for various crisis scenarios. Most of the cache units from that program had been retrieved in the early 1980s when the project was officially concluded, but apparently some had been missed or their locations lost during the declassification and retrieval process. The DIA representative was particularly interested in the classified container Marcus had documented but not opened. He confirmed that such containers typically held intelligence materials, including encryption keys, communication protocols, and information about intelligence assets and operations. The fact that this container had remained sealed and undisturbed for 5 decades was fortunate from a security perspective, as the information inside, while historically significant, could potentially still be relevant to current operations or could compromise individuals who had served in intelligence roles. The attorney raised the legal questions the brothers had been anticipating. Technically, their actions in opening the cylinder and documenting its contents could be construed as unauthorized access to classified materials, which was a federal offense. However, he acknowledged that the brothers had discovered the cache through legitimate salvage operations, had acted responsibly throughout their investigation, and had voluntarily disclosed their findings to appropriate authorities. Under these circumstances, the Justice Department was prepared to take no legal action against them, provided they agreed to certain conditions. The conditions were straightforward but significant. The brothers would turn over all physical materials they had recovered from the cache, including the logbook and any other documents. They would provide the government with copies of all their documentation and video footage. They would not publicly disclose specific details about the cache's location or contents without prior approval from the appropriate authorities. In return, the government would formally acknowledge their discovery, ensure they received appropriate salvage compensation for their work, and agreed to work with them on declassifying and releasing as much information as possible for historical purposes. Marcus and Daniel agreed to these terms. While they wouldn't be able to immediately share everything they had learned, they had achieved their primary goal, ensuring that this remarkable piece of history would be properly documented and eventually become part of the public record. The government representatives assured them that a declassification review would be conducted, and within a reasonable time frame, most of the information about Project Deep Watch would likely be released to the National Archives where historians and researchers could access it. Over the following months, the brothers worked closely with government historians and archivists to properly document and preserve what they had found. The cylinder itself was eventually retrieved in a military operation that brought it to the surface for the first time since its placement in 1972. The contents were carefully catalogued, with most items being transferred to museums or archives after appropriate declassification review. The classified container was quietly transported to a secure facility where its contents could be properly evaluated, and the Navy commander later informed Marcus that the materials inside had indeed been historically significant, providing insights into Cold War intelligence operations that would eventually enrich the historical record. The story of the brothers' discovery was eventually released to the public, though not in the dramatic fashion they might once have imagined. A carefully crafted press release from the Department of Defense acknowledged that civilians had discovered a Cold War-era cache and had responsibly reported their findings to authorities. A longer article in a military history journal provided more details about Project Deep Watch and its role in Cold War contingency planning. Slowly, as declassification proceeded, more information became available to researchers and the public. Marcus and Daniel returned to their salvage business, their brief adventure as discoverers of classified secrets becoming a remarkable story they could share with friends and family. The salvage fee they received from the government for their work and cooperation was substantial enough to secure their business's future for years to come. More importantly, they had the satisfaction of knowing they had handled an extraordinary situation with integrity, balancing their curiosity and desire for historical truth against legitimate security concerns and legal obligations. The buoy that had led them to their discovery was eventually returned to them as a memento, its chains cut free and its history now known. They mounted it outside their office, a conversation piece that never failed to attract attention and questions. For those who asked about it, they had a story to tell, a true story about how a routine salvage operation had uncovered a piece of hidden history and revealed a small part of the vast, secret infrastructure that had existed during one of the most dangerous periods in human history. Years later, as more documents from Project Deep Watch were declassified and released, the full scope of the program became clearer. The 12 cache units had been part of a comprehensive plan to ensure the United States could maintain covert operations capabilities even in worst-case scenarios involving nuclear war or conventional invasion. Each cache had been positioned to support different types of operations: intelligence gathering, sabotage, communication with surviving government officials, or support for resistance movements. The caches represented millions of dollars of investment and thousands of hours of planning, all in preparation for scenarios that, thankfully, never came to pass. The story of Cache Unit 7 and its accidental discovery by two salvage operators became a minor footnote in Cold War history, appearing in books and documentaries about the era's secret programs. For Marcus and Daniel Reeves, it remained the defining experience of their professional lives, a reminder that extraordinary discoveries could come from the most routine beginnings, and that sometimes the greatest mysteries are found not in distant places but hidden just beneath the surface of familiar waters, waiting patiently for someone curious enough to investigate what lies below. Before we close, we want to thank you for watching this incredible journey of discovery. If you haven't already, make sure you're subscribed to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss another amazing story like this one. And if this tale of Cold War secrets and underwater mysteries has captivated you, please consider supporting our channel with a super thanks or by becoming a channel member. Your support helps us bring more incredible true stories to light. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this discovery too. Drop a comment below telling us what you think was the most fascinating part of this story, and don't forget to let us know where in the world you're watching from. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and remember that sometimes the most extraordinary discoveries are hiding in the most unexpected places, just waiting to be found.